In the heart of Eindhoven stands the Marienhage monastery of the Augustine order. The history of Marienhage goes back to the year 1419, when 5 devout citizens of Eindhoven chose for a community life following the precepts of St. Augustine. The ancient house is the oldest building in the city. The historic remains have been absorbed within the new buildings with dignity, remains that testify to a very eventful past with the devastating Reformation of French occupation. The Abbey church is now also a parish church. The Augustinians have from way back, less than the other orders, been for all of their lives bound to one single monastery.
One of the major characteristics of our order as it has grown is most surely our availability, that we are prepared to go wherever we are most needed. And from there, our superiors have been able to send us on not to those places we choose ourselves, but to where they decide we can be of best service to the church and the community.
St. Augustine of Hippo, who lived in the 4th century, never himself founded an order. He wrote down rules and his followers lived by them.
Across the centuries, St. Augustus has always been portrayed with a burning heart. That is, in the first place, a sign that for him the love of God and the love for God is at the very center of things. And with that burning heart, you can also think of the words of Augustus, who said, "Restless is the heart that finds rest in God." And therefore we too so gladly see Augustus with that burning heart and preach it too.
The first followers of Augustine were hermits, but later the order directed itself more and more towards society, the daily lives of people. In even later times, people placed great emphasis on St. Augustine's flight from the world, as though in his fear of temptation by the world he radically turned his back on it, and that his austerity and celibacy were signs of that.
When Augustus speaks of his food and drink, he says, "You know, O Lord, I am no drunkard, but love the delicious food. You know already, Lord, that I did have difficulty in passing that up." And then he goes on in the same vein, not only about his sense of taste, his sense of smell, but also his sense of touch, with which he caressed in the days he had a girlfriend. Often I have asked myself, what, for Augustus, was the reason for coupling his conversion to the Catholic Church with celibacy? You might well argue that it was for a methodical reason, but not for Augustus, surely, because he found it so nice to go through life without somebody at his side. Yet I read from his confession that the importance of celibacy for him was unity, and in this way to resist distraction. When someone is more close to you than others, as with a friend or girlfriend, I think we must also mention sexual relationships, for exactly because of that sexual differentiality, you can be distracted. To resist that distraction, he chose for a celibate life. I think it important that, through a loss as it were, by means of a sort of sting, one is set on the road to God. I would call it a kill or cure remedy.
Celibacy as rough remedy, because the one, the required total dedication to godliness, cannot stand the other, the leaning towards worldly surroundings, as the monastery dog here in Eindhoven cannot stand the monastery bell.
When people believe they are withdrawing, they often believe they are withdrawing from evil. that evil is thus placed outside yourself. Now, Augustus denies that emphatically. You always take yourself along, and so you are therefore yourself a bit of the evil. He does believe in world distance. Distance is, of course, something different than flight, but for him there is in the end deliverance, the moment of delivery. Just as Christ in incarnation also did not flee from our evil, but went straight through it. Thus, it is for him, too, very important that the people in the world go through evil. To, as it were, dare to let yourself be infected by the evil, or at least dare to admit to be infected. And in that sense, Augustus even speaks of felix culpa, a happy guilt. He isn't so afraid of guilt, he's not so afraid of evil. It is exactly by going about with evil, in a certain way, namely to acknowledge the evil, not go around it, to admit, to avow, that you fall short, that God gets a chance. You see that with Augustus his whole life, the admitting of the personal failure and praising God's greatness. Those two elements that, as it were, must make the world better.
Wanneer wij echter het goddelijk officie bidden, hetzij in gemeenschap, hetzij afzonderlijk, moeten wij ons vooral hierop toeleggen dat, zoals de regel vermaant, de woorden die wij uitspreken ook in ons hart leven. Dit zullen wij gemakkelijker bereiken als wij ons een rijkere kennis van liturgie en Bijbel, vooral van de psalmen, hebben verworven. Tot zover de lezing uit de constituties van onze orde.
An order is, so Augustus puts it, the harmony that exists between unequal parts, parts that were not hacked off by any agency whatever in such a way that they all resemble one another. I experience that also in the brotherhood, not in the sense of a sort of sociable company, sitting on top of one another, but a brotherhood that, in spite of the fact that you are totally different from me, the one still sees the other as brother, still wishes to be near, if not on a verbal level, then on all sorts of other levels, but who nevertheless seeks nearness and won't give up that nearness.
St. Augustine himself lived together with friends in one house. It wasn't and isn't about conviviality. It's about deep respect for each other's personal nature and experience. Because each of the brothers comes from his own world, each has his own memories and forgotten stories, sometimes from far countries. One of those forgotten stories is that of rich Roman life, a whole culture that has nearly been lost. In the Monastery of Marienhage, it's commemorated lovingly in a private museum, that of Father Leopold Verhagen, Augustinian, once a much-loved presenter of the final programme on nightly television.
If you want to stock a good museum, you must be smart, but still honest. Smart because you must make people warm to giving you things, but you mustn't directly ask them. That is indecent. No, rather you must tell it in such a way that they are glad to give it to you. That is the art. Because there are enough of the stupid and honest, there's nothing to that. All those relics, all those reminders from the distant past, all those reminders of people who have been dead for years, they make the past much more alive, which is what makes sense of keeping those instruments of torture, of which I have quite a lot in the museum. Then too, people were very much aware that sin was a big insult to God, and so the monks set out to do the opposite, to pay penance, to hurt themselves, just as Christ suffered pain for the sins of man. The saints, they have served God in their bodies, and they regarded the body as an instrument to serve God in all possible ways. And whosoever reveres a relic also reveres that body as an instrument to serve God.
In Marla, below Brugge, a community of women lives according to St. Augustine's precepts. They live in a house with a long and rich history, a real castle that in the 16th century was the property of the Counts of Flanders. Here we meet in our day a branch of the Augustinian family with a name that is a mouthful, the Order of the Regular Canons of the Holy Grave or Sepulchre, an order that found her origins in the Jerusalem of the Crusaders. No one less than Godfried of Bouillon founded in 1099 a chapter of monks that had as task to take care of the services in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and give hospitality to the pilgrims. The male branch of this order died out during the French Revolution. The female was able to sustain itself. In Flanders, shortly after the founding of the order, a sister convent came into being, the St.Trudo Abbey in Brugge. In the middle of the 20th century, that community almost died out. The authorities of the church seemed to accept it. They even promoted closure. But they didn't reckon on the sisters, who didn't wish to have their community die out.
We had really an amazing history behind us. But in the year 1950, the end of the Abbey was in sight. It was only a small, impoverished group that lived together there, and measures were taken to give them a quiet old age. But the sisters themselves didn't wish to go under and looked for a helper, whom they found in a monk from St. Peter's Abdij in St. Brugge. Philips de Kloet would stand by them, and he gave them the advice to look for help with other canons. They found that help in the Netherlands. They came to the Holy Grave Priory of Lochem, now in Maarsen, and there received help from the prioress, a Flemish sister, Mother Maria Josepha. With that help, they allied themselves with the Order of the Holy Grave, and that happened in 1952. The Abbey of Sint-Trudo was accepted into this order and retained its independence. With 4 sisters from Lochem and 3 Flemish sisters from Turnhout, we then came to Sint-Trudo and the small community revived. We conferred how we could build an existence that had to be in accordance with the assignment of the canonical community. That is, to live with each other in the service of God and the people. After endless discussions and negotiations, it was decided to move to Marla, and there to make a whole new beginning. We now have 36 sisters. The oldest are the sisters who came here from Lochem and from Turnhout, but all the others have started their convent life here in Marla.
Now the renewed convent community lives in an age-old building and has made a new start, a start that is now flourishing in an amazing way. The question is why this new community, with its many relics from earlier ages, is doing so well, whilst many sister congregations, foundations from the 19th century, are threatened with extinction. In 1950, the rejuvenated foundation that entered the old castle also faced the question of survival. There were only a few left. The beginning of the 50s was for the still small community of sisters a romantic period. They had rented the castle from the Baron owner, to be sure, but they hadn't a penny to their name. They literally lived on what the state brought them. In retrospect, it's hard to believe that they succeeded, and what's more, that they now live in a complex that once again forms an architectural whole.
Geen hoop meer was in heel dat land. Maar kom, ik heb daar toch wel moeite van gehad.
The canons had to look for their own economic basis, and found that in the contemporary form of apostolic service. So they made use of the many needs of laymen who in our time want to put themselves in the service of the religious life in the world, who wish to teach catechism, who wish to inspire contemplation groups, who wish to lead liturgy renewals. Those people come to Sint-Trudo Abbey for training, for mutual conferring. It is an abbey that carries hospitality in its banner. Hospitality. In the Sint-Trudo Abbey, you have to think instinctively of the image of the safe haven that, according to St. Augustine, an abbey must be. Every haven, he wrote, has somewhere a way in. So in some way or another it is open, and a storm can break in. What matters is that the nuns in the haven are unified. Let them be a good support to each other. Don't let them crush one another. No, the evenness of the balance, the love that itself always remains the same, must be taken into account. Then the haven will be safe. Is this what people think about the Abbey of Marley? You could almost say so, because the community flourishes unlike many other sister congregations.
Ik neem direct aan dat er gewichtige zaken zijn om over na te denken. Maar is dat een reden om aan het minder gewichtige gedachteloos voorbij te gaan?
Most of the 19th century orders were founded to meet certain social needs, such as the care for the sick, for the elderly, for orphans, for education. The canon life, on the other hand, is not bound to a certain apostolate form. He who wishes to enter here doesn't choose for a specific type of service, but for a canonical way of life as a whole.
Dan stak hij zijn zware voet in de kier. Politionele overmacht. Vaak bereikt men de deur pas langs een voortuin met hek. Het hek is zelf al een soort deur, maar houdt gewoonlijk niemand tegen. De voortuin kan een vriendelijk onthaal voorspellen. Dan staat hij vol bloemen. Hij wil de bezoeker eer aandoen. Hebt u al gemerkt dat wie een huis binnentreedt niet meer helemaal dezelfde is als die voor de deur stond?
The sisters exemplify in their abbey an open house of which Romano Guardini has written, and which is at the same time an open church, a place where the one offers a resting place to the other on his great journey to the eternal home. The centre here is the Abbey Church and her liturgy.
To the canonic tasks belong the celebration of the liturgy as an open service. When in 1970 the breviary, Prayers for Every Day, appeared in the Dutch language, the community under the leadership of Professor Ignace de Soeter and Father Marcel Weemaas exerted itself to make the periodic prayer of our convent communities into a sung community prayer. By Professor de Soeter, we came into contact with northern Dutch poets and musicians, usually Protestants, to whom we have much to thank for the celebration of our liturgy.